think I've done it. I think I've actually done it. I think, without a doubt, I might have found the oldest artefact in the museum. No, it's not Rocket, and no, it's not the granite railed piece from the Eaton Tramway, although I was surprised to see that thing in the warehouse on my last visit. It's not even an engine, and the item itself dates back to at least 1798. To put it into context, that's when George Washington was still alive, Napoleon was causing havoc on the high seas, and George Stephenson had just started his first job while attending night school. What we're looking at today is 4 simple wheels connected with an oak beam. It's all that remains of the original coal wagon run on the Little Eaton Tramway. It's a fact that before the railway, there were canals. Canals were the most modern and efficient way to transport items from A to B, with barges and horses taking the strain. In Derby, the transport network was poor at best. The roads were dangerous and inadequate, and the River Derwent was prone to flooding, hardly useful for getting produce in and out. The idea of a canal between the poor town of Derby and the coal-rich town of Sandyacre was touted as far back as 1771. The canal would branch at Derby, north towards the town of Little Eaton and south towards Swarkston. Because of the incline between Little Eaton and Tedembury Colliery, which was too great for the canal network, it was decided a tramway would be implemented. The cost of this endeavour would reach upwards of £60,000, so over £60 million in today's money, and this was raised in the selling of shares in the project. The plan was given parliamentary assent in 1793, and the work began. The Little Eaton Tramway ran from the end of the canal at Little Eaton to the colliery pits of Denby. It was built alongside the canal network and took 2 years to finish, overseen by the director of the business, Benjamin Outram. Benjamin Outram was an established canal builder and engineer. He was also a pioneer of the L-shaped rail. These rails were unique. They were made from cast iron and shaped in an L shape. Unlike most modern engines which sit on the rails with an inner flange, the trucks sat inside the rails themselves, and the rails guided the trucks where they needed to go. Outram was also one of the first engineers to use stone blocks as sleepers. The sleepers held the rails, which were only 3 foot long, with a notch at the end of the rail, and a spike was hammered into a pre-drilled hole with an oak plug holding everything in place. To minimise cost and wasted land, just a single track was built with 9 passing loops integrated at specific points. From research and photos of the points, it appears that the points were specially constructed for the unusual rail arrangements, with raised flanges on the rails to help move the carts over the points. Although it can't be certain, there appears to be no mechanics to these points' movements, so it can only be assumed that the points were operated by hand, or rather, with a swift kick. The unusual rail arrangement was not the only unusual feature of this tramway. The trucks themselves were engineered to be as efficient as possible right from the ground up. The wagons were created at the Butterley Works and were probably Outram's very own design. In a thirst for modernisation, rather than unloading the cargo at the canal wharf, the whole wagon can come apart from its wheels and be lifted onto the waiting barges, saving time and, more importantly, money. The lower part of the wagon was also very cleverly engineered. The main axles on the wagons were made of cheap, durable oak rather than cast iron, and to provide lubrication to the wheels, an inverted axle box was used. The main lubricant was not expensive oil, but the more common, cheaper substance called tallow. Tallow is made from rendered animal fats, and it was cheap and plentiful. Tallow was used in everyday life in the 1800s and could be used from cleaning to a substitute for wax. The idea is simple. As the axles were under use, the axles would get hot. what in railway speak we call a hotbox. Today, a hotbox would be very, very bad, but the tramway relied on this heat. The heat from the hotbox would melt the solid tallow and it would flow into the joints, lubricating them. It was simple but ingenious. Even the braking system was so simple, it just worked. If you want to stop the vans, you just jam the wheel with a handy stick, also known as a sprag, just to make it sound fancy. The entire tramway was ready by 1795, and to much ceremony and fanfare, it opened. Delegates and guests were allowed, as a one-off, to travel in the carts themselves with seats erected for them. Just 24 hours later, the tramway got to work with its first shipment of coal, already making its way to Derby. Like other coal tramways, horsepower led the way. Teams of horses would make their way up and down the tramway delivering coal and other goods to the waiting canal barges. It was calculated that 4 horses could pull about 8 loaded wagons every day, with a groomsman or driver at the front leading the way. By 1805, production had grown and the track gauge was increased from 3 foot to 4 foot, and the track was relaid to handle heavier loads. All was going smoothly for the tramway. However, progress was catching up with the little line. In the 1830s, horsepower suffered a huge blow when steam was proven triumphant at the Rainhill trials, and up and down the country, horsepower was making way for it. Strangely though, although other collieries were already experimenting with the idea, there were no plans to make a steam engine for the Little Eaton. It resisted change. Sadly, it was this apparent resistance that led to its eventual demise. In 1856, work had just been completed on Midland Railway's newest branch line to Ripley. The new railway line proved over-successful, and the colliery started to move its trade from the canals to the rails. This caused the Little Eaton to lose the majority of its main trade overnight. Although the tramway did lose its main share of the freight, it still had a job to do feeding the canal network with other goods, and managed to keep going for an impressive 50 years, still handling the goods the same way as it did in 1795. However, by the 1900s, the canals were being used more for pleasure than for freight, and faced with the lack of work, the Little Eaton hung up its horseshoes for good in 1908, with over 100 years of service. The tramway and the canal has sadly been lost to time. The line now forms part of the A61 road network, and there's little of any evidence of a tramway at all. The only serving remnants that are still in situ is the old wharf building and an old bridge, and a 2-arch bridge over Bottle Brook, which, although was built after the tramway's destruction, does contain some of the old stone sleepers within its walls. The cart, by a slim miracle, survived the destruction of the tramway. No one knows how it ended up in the hands of the National Collection, but it was on display at the National Mining Museum for many years. Over time, replicas were built to showcase Outtram's unique work and how cleverly these wagons were designed. After a time, the wagon was transferred to the Railway Museum, where it remains in the warehouse to this day. I can't obviously say for certain that the wagon is stored in the warehouse would have been round at the beginning of the tramway, although the museum has managed to date the wheels to 1798. So these simple wheels may hold the claim to be the oldest artefact we have, and the earliest examples of a railway we have in the museum. The tramway resisted the modern world for over 100 years, but thanks to Outtram's unique designs, it was probably more modern than most in its own right.